Today, my talk is about Walter Raleigh and Thomas Harriot, scientist, hermeticist, and the English colonization of the Americas. Today, I will suggest that the bonds between Harriot and Raleigh went well beyond that of patron and client and intimate friendship, that they shared a hermeticist view of the world, that Raleigh was a considerable scientist in his own right, and that they possessed mutual interest in this regard, and that their mutual work in colonizing reflected their other shared interests. Hermeticism was a Christian religious philosophy of elites, both Catholic and Protestant. It was very popular with scientists in Europe, particularly those interested in the fields that became later known as physics and chemistry, and also medical practitioners. Francis Bacon, himself a hermeticist, and often thought of as the father of empiricism, the modern scientific method that is, cited three scientists as models of his time, as scientists for using experiments in the new scientific inquiry that also led to better understanding of the divine. And these three men he named as Raleigh, Harriot, and the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, all of whom were connected by friendship and scientific interest in Hermeticism and alchemy. Hermeticists, scientists shared a belief that God created all things. And to discover the purpose of things would bring humans closer to understanding God, because you're understanding God's creation, his purpose. Many of these things were invisible or remained otherwise undetected by humans. Gravity could not be seen, but Galileo detected its existence and conducted experiments. Both Galileo and Thomas Harriot created optics for better seeing the surface of the moon. Harriot theorized the unseen atoms in all things. Raleigh and others interested in medicine were concerned with the medicinal properties of plants and crystals. Again, these were unseen characteristics. You couldn't see how they worked. The mixing of substances in the laboratory, which they called manipulation and also alchemy, was the goal of many of the Renaissance scientists. Getting proportions of each substance correct was imperative. The correct proportions could lead to cordials used in healing an array of diseases. Incorrect proportions could create poisons that killed, hence the creation of a new discipline by another hermeticist, toxicology. Interest in science mutually bound together Thomas Harriot and Walter Raleigh. Harriot came out of Oxford. He was the expert mathematician and scientific genius who instructed Raleigh and then Raleigh's mariners on how to navigate ships to America. But Raleigh's interest in science preceded his meeting Harriot. Raleigh's much older half-brothers, Humphrey, Adrian, and John Gilbert, were all alchemists. Humphrey not only wrote an alchemical text, but he lobbied Queen Elizabeth to build an academy that would include the teaching of alchemy as one of its chief offerings. And he also lobbied for repeal of a medieval law against alchemy. The Gilberts and Raleigh frequently consulted the Queen's mathematician and astrologer, Dr. John Dee, not only for his great geographical knowledge of the world, but for readings on when should they sail to America. Alchemists most famously searched for the philosopher's stone with all the great power that stone would provide, and Dee himself moved to the Holy Roman Empire to continue his search for the stone. Raleigh's alchemical interest concerned the properties of minerals. And more famously, in his own time, he became famous for discovery of precious stones of great medicinal value. Even more famously, in his laboratory, he created cordials for healing. And some of these took dozens of ingredients and included dozens of processes, and were quite complex. And we have many of these recipes in a variety of archives. Robert Boyle, often labeled the founder of modern chemistry, modeled his career on Raleigh. Boyle's father, Richard, the Earl of Cork and the richest man in Ireland, was given by Raleigh a precious stone used for healing. And though Cork was the richest man in Ireland, this was his most prized possession. His son, Robert, testified to the stone's power, also recreated several of Raleigh's cordials from the recipes and pronounced their efficacy at curing many diseases. King Charles II's physician wrote an entire book about Raleigh's most famous cordial as he analyzed and reconstructed the ingredients and processes. This famous Raleigh's cordial, sometimes also called the King's cordial, was used by English royalty through centuries. And it was manufactured in the United States until the early 20th century. I cite these things to show that Raleigh's scientific work was taken seriously, not only in his own lifetime, but for over a century after his death. He was no dilettante in the laboratory. In fact, while imprisoned by King James I in the Tower of London, he was likely the most famous producer of medicine in England, since visitors to the court from overseas, as well as locals, sought cures from the king's most famous prisoner. And why shouldn't they? Queen Anne, the king's wife, testified that Raleigh's medicine had saved her life when her own many physicians had failed. It was her intervention that won Raleigh the right to have a laboratory in the Tower of London, in which he was permitted, because of her intervention, 24-hour access. Thomas Harriot was given permission to visit Raleigh in prison, and it was Raleigh who apparently brought him and Henry Percy, the Wizard Earl, ingredients for their alchemical practices, both in the Tower and before they were imprisoned in their private lives. The Earl of Northumberland and Raleigh would just keep selling each other back and forth the ingredients, and Harriot kept record of these because he was often the one transmitting them back and forth. Northumberland became Harriot's patron after Raleigh couldn't do so anymore. And the three enjoyed each other's companies in the Tower of London when the Earl and Raleigh were imprisoned there, and allegedly frequently played cards there as well. Thus, although today it is Harriot who's renowned as the scientist, as well he should be, Raleigh in his own time, in many ways, was more famous, at least in the public eye. When Henry, Prince of Wales, lay dying, and dozens of the king's physicians failed to heal the young man, the king's prisoner, Raleigh, was called on to effect a cure. Raleigh noted it was too late, and the prince did die. But it's, again, fascinating that here he is under pain of death, and they feel desperate enough that they turn to the king's prisoner, because of his renown with medicine, to create a medicine to heal the prince. And again, I remind that Francis Bacon had included Raleigh among the three great men of science of his time. At Oxford, Harriot studied under Thomas Allan, one of England's foremost mathematicians and hermeticists. When Raleigh was granted a huge parcel of land, about 250 square miles of land in Southern Ireland to colonize, he granted large parcels to Allan and to Harriot. And the three of them moved to Ireland and lived by one another, very close. It was in Ireland at Raleigh's house in Youghal, where Raleigh planted the potatoes that Harriot had brought back from America, which more than likely were the exact crop that spread through Ireland. There were previous potatoes from Spain, from Spanish America, but this was not the strain that caught on in Ireland. The first place the plant grew widely and prodigiously was on the border of counties Cork and Waterford, precisely where Raleigh and Harriot lived. It is also believed that Harriot finished the writing of his book about Virginia while living with Raleigh in his house in Ireland. The other extremely important figure who worked with Harriot and Raleigh on the Roanoke colony and also settled on his lands in Ireland was John White, the painter. Many of the Hermeticists, including Raleigh, Harriot, and White, were highly sympathetic to native cultures, and they were also tolerant of Christian diversity. Historians without evidence sometimes label Raleigh as a radical Protestant, but indeed he was anything but. Raleigh's associates, friends, and relatives included many Catholics, and in fact, they're going to comprise a large percentage of those sent by Raleigh to colonize in Ireland. His book, The History of the World, it is a tome that spends a lot of time talking about the need for tolerance of both denominationally among Christians, but also of heathen religion as well. Raleigh will claim in that book that many people who were not Christian lived more moral lives than alleged Christians, and he made repeated arguments for people in history and in his own time as being loved by God, though they knew not Christ. After Roanoke, Raleigh produced a paper for Queen Elizabeth and her advisors recommending against sending missionaries to the native peoples of America. This paper is titled Of the Voyage for Guyana. He noted a people have the right to assault outsiders, in other words, foreigners, who try to steer them away from their religion. Missionaries should only be sent if people asked for them. In fact, Raleigh proposed to Elizabeth that England build an empire without conquest. And that's an exact quote from him. That she offered to ally with the natives and offer them not only weapons to defend themselves, but the means to do so in the future by teaching them how to manufacture the weapons. The Indians should accept the Queen as their greater sovereign, much as in King Arthur's time, he was a greater sovereign over other kings, but that they would maintain their own lives and lifestyle and their own king. He wasn't talking about trying to change their culture and who they are. In exchange for the alliance, they should accept one representative from the Queen to help them with foreign policy. But he reminds Elizabeth and her advisors that the land belongs to the Indians. And he provides a litany of reasons of why it was just and moral to not conquer, but to befriend the natives and even to accept their heathenism. And one of his most fascinating proposals, he said, if male natives did convert to Christianity, then after they did so, English women should be sent to America to marry the native men to bring the peoples closer together. But again, he's not arguing that native people should change their culture, just that the English and natives should grow closer through intermarriage, as elites in different kingdoms often did to bring peoples together. Raleigh's toleration of native culture and peoples is evident in the writings of Thomas Harriot and the drawings of John White, which Raleigh arranged for publication by Theodore de Bry, who engraved White's paintings. This volume on Virginia, on Roanoke Island and the surrounding areas, was printed in 4 languages and enjoyed a phenomenal shelf life. Its pictures reproduced for centuries, even to the present day. The Virginia volume included Harriot's book, A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, the first book about America written by someone who actually went there. Often overlooked by scholars, however, is the quality and character of the text that Harriot provides to explain the engravings of John White's pictures. Together, the text and the engravings provide the most important ethnography of indigenous peoples in the future United States until the invention of the camera in the 19th century. They reflect a sober and intriguing depiction of natives at different stages of life, such as taking them from small children to aged people, in other words, the elderly. They display their ceremonies, dancing, cooking, fishing, eating, and their ingenious skills. And part of the reason for this approach, besides the fact that Raleigh wants to show what the English have accomplished by being able to interact with peoples in such a way that they could describe their daily life, is to represent the experiential method of observation, which they do in the paintings and in the text. For instance, the display of the varying fields of maize side by side to illustrate just how the people cultivated maize in 3 stages. Harriot's text and White's illustrations also reflect a Hermeticist view of the natives, where Raleigh and others believe that the natives had been blessed by God. Even without their knowledge of Christ, God had taught them all that was necessary to flourish in America, from their skills to feeding themselves with so many different ways to snare fish, to the masterful piraguas, their canoe-style boats that they created, and a variety of other ways they learned to take care of themselves and flourish. Without these skills, the colonists starved. As we know, at Roanoke, they starved. Ralph Lane learned to his dismay that the English were not prepared to fish. They couldn't repair the weirs to catch the fish. And growing increasingly frustrated, of course, he leads the assault on the local natives, which poisons relationships with them so that the area could not be settled and that they really needed to colonize elsewhere, which they'll eventually do up in the Chesapeake. The lesson here is that force does not work with the natives, that cooperation, which Raleigh had already been recommending, should be the way. Raleigh will, of course, take the phenomenal route of choosing the painter John White to be governor, something that's really unprecedented in the history of colonialism, as far as I know, that instead of a military man or a political appointee with political experience, he select a painter because this person knows how to get along with the local people. Raleigh carried these ideas of cooperation with him in his future colonial projects in Ireland and in South America and Guyana. Harriot worked on both those colonial projects, and White worked on the Irish one, working with local Native communities. As we know, however, cooperation and co-creation and Raleigh's idea of an empire without conquest all ultimately failed to characterize English-British colonial history. Cooperation was used as a necessity, and conquest was intermittently attempted, but Raleigh's idea of co-creation was set aside. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do now is to share some of the pictures of both White's watercolors and the engravings of those by DeBry, of course, which Harriot wrote the text that accompanies these, and to discuss the connection between those 3 men and Hermeticism and overseas expansion into Virginia. I start with this picture, which you might be wondering, what the heck does this have to do with Native peoples in Virginia? But this is the engraving that DeBry used to open up the Virginia volume. It's of Adam and Eve, obviously. There was a lot of discussion in Europe about whether the native peoples of America descended from Adam and Eve, or whether there was a second Adam and Eve, because there was great confusion over why did God hide all the peoples of the Americas from the rest of the world. And many of the hermeticists, including Arthur Barlow, who was one of the leaders of the first expedition to Roanoke, thought they were of a second Adam and Eve. And this is going to be very controversial in Europe, that why didn't God put them in the Bible then? And so in the second volume, which came out about the Florida Indians, DeBry changed the depiction to this one of Noah reaching land. It's fascinating to use this picture. It's confused people over the centuries who, whenever this book has been reproduced, this picture is always left out because people look at it and go, what could this possibly have to do with the natives of Florida? But it's actually, I think, the most important picture in the Florida book. The painters, the engraver here is one of the DeBrys himself. The DeBrys were the leading publishers of Hermeticist texts in Europe. And it's a fascinating picture here. You could see what this does is it straightens out from the first volume on Virginia to show that the native peoples indeed are in the Bible and that they're descendants of one of Noah's sons or grandchildren. But what's also apparent in this picture is this is a typical Hermeticist illustration. You can see the fire here. Noah has made a sacrifice in the lower corner here, and the great flames coming up from it. Fire is the key item in Hermeticism, going all the way back to Moses seeing God in the burning bush, because this was an example in the Bible of humans being able to see God himself. So it connects the spiritual to the physical realm. And so here you have fire, the great ignition, which transforms things into new things. And here the fire is giving off smoke. And of course, this is a holy fire, and it's giving off this great smoke. And at the top, you see the smoke leads to Hebrew letters, which spell out Yahweh, as many Christians call the pronunciation. Because in actuality, though, this is the unpronounceable name of God. And the point of this picture then is to show not only that the natives are descended from Noah, so they are part of the biblical humanity, but they are blessed by God here. And this picture we'll see in other pictures. I'll show you in just a little bit, but let me go on to the next picture. Because for one thing, they show many pictures of fire, and each fire is very different. Harriot notes that in the text, and it has different purposes. Here it's an ingenious use of fire to make their boats. And the purpose of showing native ingenuity, as in this one on fishing, that the natives have learned to do so many things. Where did they learn it from? They learned it from God. God has prepared them. He has blessed them to use this land, even though he did not introduce them to his son, Jesus Christ. So they're still blessed people, a people that the Europeans can learn from because they have enjoyed God's favor. And here you see the weirs and the fishing. This is even night fishing. You can see with the fire inside the boat. And so you could see the spearing in the back. And of course, at Roanoke, the English were starving. And Ralph Lane will note that the reason they're starving is they don't have the skill as the Indians do at the fishing. They don't know how to repair the weirs when they break. And they certainly don't have time now to grow corn, which they hadn't done. And here you see this is a watercolor of the engraving of the fields. It also, if you look in the bottom left and the top center, you can see fires. Those are fires that Harriot is describing. Again, every fire has its different purpose. On the right, you can see 3 different fields, F, G, and H, of different fields of maize, because the natives have 3 crops a year. So they were English were pretty amazed at that. But it shows how orderly the natives are and how they're flourishing in this land that God has granted them. You can see the orderliness of Pomiac, their house, and these pictures are very much the pictures of observers who are trying to give a sober description and recollection of what is in America. This is White's picture, for instance, of just how the natives broil their fish. He's showing how the natives move from step to step through avenues of their life. DeBry, in selling books, makes the fire really large and adds in a larger hermeticist element with the smoke in the back. Of course, that fire is so big it would just burn the fish to pieces. And you see these other pictures here, for instance. This will be engraved from White's watercolor right here. He's showing people in their daily lives, in this case, a woman carrying her child. And here's another case of an aged man to show people different stages of their lives. But let me just go back to, these pictures here, because again, you take this in and there's of course many other pictures like this, but when you put them all together, they're very different than the depictions that were being made of the Spanish in South America, for instance, where natives are often depicted as being diabolical. There's a lot of violence portrayed. There's no violence basically portrayed in the Virginia volume, even though Harriot had written about, in his book on Virginia, had written about that these wars exist, and White had asserted the same. The pictures that get published, and we don't know if he did any pictures of warfare, but they're really pictures of people doing just day-to-day exercises and relaxations, celebrations, sometimes work. You can see in this one, the natives added in hunting at the top. The overall, this is to show that the English are going to do things differently, that these natives are blessed, and I think most importantly, that the English can learn from these people, that they're worth learning from and living with in America. And so I'll leave it at that, inviting you all to take a look at White's watercolors and the engravings that were made of them. And if you want, because I go much more into this Hermeticism and to the evolving approach of Raleigh and his people, you can see my book on Walter Raleigh, Architect of Empire, which goes into much detail on the Virginia enterprise, but also integrates with it their enterprise in Ireland and Raleigh's search for El Dorado and his writing of the book, The History, the Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana. So thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.